Hello, I'm Peter Gluckman. I'm president of the International Science Council, and I have the pleasure of co-chairing this session with my dear friend, Professor Jose Vieira, who's president of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations. Together, we work very closely to advance the role of science and innovation with the multilateral system. And I think we've seen over, particularly the last 2 years with COVID, the criticality of the NGOs representing science and engineering and innovation, working together with global science cooperation in an unheralded way to make progress on one of the existential risks that we face. But we're here today as co-chairs of the Scientific and Technological Community Major Group to the United Nations to discuss what I think is a key issue. We're at the midpoint of the SDG cycle, and there are two questions that need to be asked. One is, have they been a success? How much progress has really been made? When I think and look at the world, climate change is not yet adequately being dealt with. Conflict is in a more terrible state than it was in 2015. We've had the experience of an enormous pandemic, which is a long way from being complete. Social cohesion in many countries is under threat. Inequality has grown. The digital world is producing opportunities, but a number of threats and challenges. And yet, if you go back to the optimism of 2012 to 15, when the SDGs were agreed to and added to, one might have hoped that by now we would have seen progress rather than a far greater progress we've seen in some of these areas. So the first question has to be, why have we made disappointing progress? What are the issues that the science community should be aware of? What are as we have particular responsibilities? And then the second question comes, given the amount of negotiation that would be needed, what might replace the SDGs in 2030? What would be a new agenda? Who would own it? How accountable would it be? How would we monitor it? There's many questions to ask. Is it that it should only be for UN and member states? Is there a way of having a more inclusive approach? These are all issues that are there. Now, we have a very distinguished panel, which my colleague Jose Vieira is going to chair and take through their presentations. But Jose, I'll turn over to you because you may want to make some additional preliminary remarks, and then we'll open up the discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. Distinguished speakers, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, and welcome to this side event co-organized by ISC, the International Science Council, and WFO, the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, co-leaders of the Science and Technology Major Group at the United Nations High-Level Political Forum. As president of WFO, it gives me a great pleasure to open this important event, whose focus is centered on advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, reflecting on the progress made and the difficulties in increasing the pace of their implementation. First of all, I would like to emphasize that the fact that this event is co-organized by the major international organizations in science, technology, and engineering in itself is already a demonstration that these two organizations are highly committed to enhance international support for implementing the global partnership for sustainable development. Nowadays, we are already suffering overwhelming effects of climate change. In its latest special report, considering a global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. IPCC emphasizes that emissions of greenhouse gases due to human activities continue to increase year after year, and global warming has continued unabated, and we have witnessed an acceleration of in the sea level rise. The UNESCO Engineering Report, Engineering for Sustainable Development, released on last year's World Engineering Day, the 4th of March, stresses that climate change manifested through changes in atmospheric and oceanic conditions will impose increased and new risks on many natural and human systems, notably through changes in climate variability and in the frequency and magnitude of extreme climate events. Clearly, society is facing new threats and challenges, growing the need of alternative clean energy sources, food and freshwater shortages that are prevalent in many regions of the world, and growing concerns for the environment. On the other hand, I am also sure that only by combining the forces and knowledge of the global engineering and scientific community, it will be possible to find solutions and measures for scaling up and improving infrastructures for poverty reduction and facing the challenges of global warming and climate change, both in developed countries and mainly in developing countries where the vulnerability of infrastructures and societies is most evident. However, in addition to the involvement of scientists and engineers, closer cooperation with industry, and above all, the proactive involvement of genuinely committed policymakers is vital for a fast-track progress towards achieving the SDGs. In this side event, we will have the pleasure and opportunity to hear distinguished speakers from 5 different professional backgrounds on these challenges: politics, academia, and research. So I will present and give the floor to the reflections of our panelists. And we will start with His Excellency, Mr. Carlos Alvarado Quezada, the 48th President of Costa Rica. His Excellency, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you to Peter also for chairing this panel. I want to say hi to all the people that are here and also to the panelists, particularly to Maria Ivanova, wishing you all your best in your position in Northeastern, and also to my fellow Costa Rican, Alonso. Both of us, we started early today, 5 a.m., but we're very glad of being here. So to keep it relevant, my objective in this intervention is to add value. And I want to do so approaching this topic in 2 moments, trying to answer both the questions that Peter and Jose have proposed. And I want to separate my intervention in 2, divided in 2. 1, I'm going to talk about the relevance of the narrative of the SDGs. And second, I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience of Costa Rica. So I'm going to start with the first one, trying to address what went wrong, or if there's something that went actually wrong with SDGs. Were there too many? I believe there's always been that discussion. Why countries have not advanced? Is it a very complex agenda? So I'll try to address this. And I believe Peter somehow in the introduction set the ground for what I'm going to say. I remember when I was in office, constantly being challenged, not only locally, but globally. We were challenged by COVID-19. We were challenged by international and national and regional inequality and poverty. Climate change is constantly being a threat, but also the loss of biodiversity and the desertification. So if we keep going on and on about this, the current status of the world, you tend to feel like it's all a disaster, basically. You see so many challenges, issues, and for the regular citizen, but also for people in government and in very areas of really very relevant positions, the question is what to do. Is there a plan? Is there a plan to address all these difficult situations? Is humanity hopeless against what's going on? And I do believe that there's actually a good answer to that. The answer is yes, there is a plan. The narrative is actually there exists a plan to address many of the root causes of what is affecting humanity nowadays. So my first point is against most, if not all, of the great challenges that humanity is facing, yes, there is a plan. And it's a plan that's so comprehensive that it's not telling everybody, even though it was negotiated in the multilateral arena, which that itself, it's also massive. That's extraordinary. Let's remember that it was negotiated and discussed across the world multilaterally. So this is extraordinary itself, extraordinary tool for humanity, and it does exist. So that's my first key finding, let's call it. We have a plan for things that are going wrong in today's world. And I believe that message we have not used enough. Because if you think about it, when things start to occur and the complexity comes out, well, people say, well, is the plan the Paris Agreement? Or is the plan the gender equality agenda? The good thing about the SDGs is a comprehensive plan. And also a plan that it's perhaps very complicated for a single individual to grasp it all. But I also want to point out one thing that once Amina Mohamed, the Deputy Secretary General of United Nations, an anecdote she told me when we were discussing this. She said that back in Africa, they were talking about it, and an old lady, an African old lady said, well, the agenda is complicated because life is complicated. We have to embrace and recognize that. And particularly today, when we have the populist narratives, which tend to simplify the problems, to gain support for political agendas, but never reaching out for true solutions for the problems. It's a solution for the communications, political communications, not a solution for the actual problems. And if you look at the SDGs agenda, we have the inverse problem. We have a solution for the actual things, but we have not managed to be successful enough to communicate why it's so important. If you were to communicate what the SDGs are, which I believe is one of the things that went wrong, the SDGs are a plan for humanity. That's what they are. They are the roadmap for all of us in the planet. And it was negotiated by all of us. It's not an imposition. So that will be my first approach on what went wrong. Perhaps the narrative went wrong. We focused on fixing the actual problems, but not selling the solution. So if we're not selling the solution, it's not going to be backed up. If people do not know that's the plan for humanity, people are not going to back it up enough. So that's my first part of my intervention, because I want to respect my time, and I think I'm already overpassed it. On the second part, I want to talk a little bit about the experience of Costa Rica. And I believe it was the good thing we can share about the experience is that throughout the last 8 years of administrations, the latest 4, which I was as president of the country, we really embraced the agenda from the leadership. And that's key. If leadership does not embraces the agenda, it's going to be very hard. But then again, what is the what's the catch for politicians to embrace it? Well, once again, it's a roadmap, and it's a global roadmap for actually fixing things. In our experience, well, Costa Rica was the first country that signed the pact for following up, let's say, for implementing the SDGs. And in this pact, one of the great things of signing it is that it's not only a commitment from the executive branch of government, it's a commitment from all the powers of a country. That means the judiciary has a commitment to it, the legislative has a commitment to it, and obviously the executive branch. But also the civil society gets involved. NGOs, the private sector, different organizations of environment, of women, of young people, peasants, fishermen, indigenous communities, people with disabilities, they get involved in how we rule upon the agenda. Even though the executive kind of fosters the forum, the way it's ruled or governed is throughout all these different actors. But the good thing about it is that everybody gains ownership of the agenda. Another good thing of this is that why it's so relevant political leadership is when we were in elections, we proposed as a plan, our political plan was aligned in the different agendas with the SDGs agenda. So our plan, even before getting to government, was already aligned with all the objectives. And obviously the plan has our own objectives. But I think that if you think in terms of human rights, there's not going to be such a comprehensive agenda available. We making this, taking it from the highest level, made that the evaluation and national agenda was also aligned with the SDGs. And this is good for the part of scientific follow-up. Because if, as most scientists and serious people say, what you can measure, it doesn't exist. So putting the SDGs agenda within not only the governance of the country and a plan proposed to the citizens, but also putting it within the national evaluation agenda can tell you directly where are you advancing and where not. But that also helps bureaucracy focus in what their goals are going to be and if they are advancing. So that's a good, I believe that's a good practice. And also being part of the voluntary reports. Why? Because it also helps you keep track on how you are advancing with your agenda and gives you a sense of, how can I say, of ownership of the different actors, because the report is not only about the government or executive. You have stakeholders in the different powers of the state and of society being accountable of this and knowing where we are making progress and where we are not. So those reports work a lot. And finally, I just want to say that you can find some of that experience in the website ods.cr if people are interested in knowing a little bit about that. But going back to my first point, we have a plan. And we have to feel great about it and how it was built. Now, we must stick to the plan and sell the plan and move in the direction of action. The good thing of this plan is that it's not, you can update it, but it's not running out of fashion. On the contrary, it's more relevant by the day and as we speak. So those thoughts, it's what I believe it's relevant for me to share today. And I also want to thank the organizers, the International Science Council and the WFEO for inviting me. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, President Carlos Alvarado, for your inspiring words. And as we know that you will be with us just for more 30 minutes, maybe I can pick up one of your thoughts about the political leaderships. My idea is that we have a very good plan. We have also technical and scientific solutions for most of the problems, but we have not reached the fulfillment of these objectives. And for me, for example, a simple example, we know from maybe 30 years from now, we had the Millennium Goals and afterwards the SDGs. And we still now, we have, for example, in water and sanitation, we have still now 1 billion of people that has no access of safe clean water, and 2.5, 2.6 or 2.4, I don't know, but people that has no any sanitation scheme, adequate tanker scheme. But we can see in most of the countries where this is happening that the governments, so the political decision makers, have other priorities. These are not the priorities for the people. Most of them invest a lot of money in guns, for example, for military guns and so on. So I think that you point very well the issue that the governments must include in their political will and practice these kind of objectives. But we cannot see in most part of our planet that is not the priorities for them. So, but is my reflection on your reflection. But please stay with us a little bit more. Maybe we can have other opportunities to discuss.
Let me add one more point to that, because the president made such an important point. What distinguishes Costa Rica was that the SDGs were incorporated into the domestic narrative. If I take my own country, New Zealand, irrespective of the political parties in power, the SDGs have never been part of the domestic narrative. Never. It's the only thing that happens about the SDGs is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs produces something by way of the voluntary report. And I would suggest, and I think you've said that, Mr. President, that it is the failure that one of the major lesions here is if governments do not incorporate them explicitly into their national narrative, they cannot progress and succeed.
Okay, maybe I can have here a spare time to the President, Carlos Alvarado, if you want to say something now before you leave our meeting, please.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jose. It's actually difficult to embed this agenda domestically because it tends to be abstract sometimes, and it kind of feels like, even though it's not true, kind of feels like, oh yeah, it's an exterior imposition. We have our domestic agenda, and also now we have to comply with this additional stuff. But I believe that it's necessary to work on how we can adapt and adopt, because if you think at the end of the day, the agenda is in the best interest of the domestic public, but we don't necessarily know that as an audience locally. And a good way of thinking about, that's why I think in terms, for example, of a narrative of the planet's plan, or that we do have a plan. There is a plan, actually something brilliant. It's like a hidden treasure. because most people don't know it. And we have a planetary plan. What is it you have to do locally or domestically? Well, you have to do your part. Very similar like with climate change, which is perhaps more evident, but it's just one of the elements of the agenda. If there is a plan and a planetary plan, what is your responsibility? Your responsibility is to do your part. And to do your part is to implement and have success locally. And that can also be a challenging goal for politicians and for the public in a country. I always frame this a lot in terms of politics, because if from a political standpoint, many politicians say, well, yeah, but that's you know, that's the United Nations agenda. And you know, these people are very, sometimes very hippie and sometimes very idealistic, but the real problems, we know what the real problems are. So that's the way they dismiss the agenda. So we need to take back the agenda as we defend human rights, for example, and say, no, 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 this is critical. This goes to the medulla of the world's problems. There is a planetary plan, which is called the SDGs, and we have to do our part, each and every one of us. And just finally, because Peter mentioned, and I'm sorry if I'm exceeding my time, but Peter mentioned what's next. Well, I do believe that as a teacher of my child used to say, a good plan is always a flexible plan. And what I mean by this is that we have a good plan that it took so long to negotiate. It is so strong. We have to give this plan the chance to succeed. Also, because the time is running and the clock is ticking in many of the areas. So we need to keep pushing to achieve this. I think that one of the worst things that we can do as humankind is dismiss the SDGs. I think we fail by 2030 and say, okay, let's find something else. I think no, I think one of the problems has to do in how we sell to the public and to the politicians one of the best tools that humanity has ever created. I think that's one of the, ironically, that's one of the key problems we have.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. President. It's always a pleasure to hear from people on the land that have the responsibilities to go ahead with these plans and politics. So thank you very much. Well, let us proceed our event, and I will give the floor to Maria Ivanova, Professor and Director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at the Northeastern University in Boston. Please, Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here with this distinguished panel today on this very important topic. And I'd really like to pick up where President Alvarado left. We have a planetary plan. We need to implement it. So why are we here? Why are we where we are? And what do we need to do next? The SDGs are no longer ambitious goals. The SDGs are critical for our survival. And I saw someone in the chat put in, governments do what is really important for survival. And so indeed, if we can frame the narrative as this is what is important for our survival, at the family level, at the community level, at the national level, at the global level, governments will listen. And this is indeed where I want to take us today of how do we implement what we have decided? How do we get there? But first, why are we here? One, we have a triple planetary crisis. As the director of the UN Environment Program, Inger Anderson, says again and again, governments, civil society, business, we have a triple planetary crisis. It is climate, biodiversity, pollution reality that we need to address. But I would like to add, we also have a triple society crisis, or rather a triple reality of societal needs. And those are equity, justice, and solidarity. We need these triple society needs to be fulfilled to be able to implement our plans, to be able to actually survive in a way that would allow us to thrive as people and as communities. And for that, we actually need this triple leadership reality. We have a triple leadership needs at the personal level, at the societal level, whether the society is a community, at the village level, at the city level, at the national level, and at a global level. So we need personal, societal, and global leadership. And that leadership is necessary in a political way, but it is also imperative in terms of science and in terms of society. So this is, in my mind, how we move forward with that planetary plan that we have. How do we implement that? The conventional wisdom goes that capacity is critical. And often small countries are seen as having little capacity. And we need to improve the capacity, which is absolutely true. But the conventional wisdom also goes that large states or large powers, big states, should provide the leadership. They are the ones responsible for these crises. They are the ones with the resources, with the capacity they need to lead the way. I would like to challenge both of these conventional wisdoms. One, indeed, capacity is critical, but capacity is created. And through the work that I have led when I was at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and leading the work on the implementation of environmental conventions, the Environmental Conventions Index that we created, we discovered a rather counterintuitive and positive reality. That many countries, many developing countries, many small states are actually implementing the international commitments that they have agreed to. They are delivering on what they have promised. And so capacity is important, but capacity is created. And it's created through that political will, through that political commitment that President Alvarado talked about. Also, large states are not necessarily the ones always leading or the ones that we should wait for to lead. A lot of small states in the work that we have done on the implementation of the global environmental agreements are showing incredible promise and delivery on what they have done. Rwanda is, for me, a case in point, a very small country, landlocked in Africa, that has taken global leadership again and again on climate, on biodiversity, on pollution. Rwanda is out in front. It is not at the absolute front of the leadership, but you see that it is improving over time. How is that being done? How is it building its capacity? How is it creating its leadership role? And so this is indeed the work that I'm now committed to, is that small states are really critical to resolving big issues. So on the issue of how we move next, the leadership that we're looking for, it will come from the spaces where traditionally we have expected at least. Costa Rica is a small state, and we see what has happened in Costa Rica, where it is way ahead of the pack. Rwanda is a small state. Originally, I come from Bulgaria, which in my mind is also on the smaller side. Yes, Peter says maybe, but the definition of a small state is not only small in territory or in population, but a country that punches above its weight. Leadership that allows a state to punch above its weight. So then the definition of small can really move on that spectrum. How can you punch above your weight? And this brings me to the role of science in terms of what do we do next, and the critical role of the International Science Council in moving forward this agenda on implementation through empowering science. So science is the connector, is that glue that allows us to bring this new narrative that President Alvarado talked about, or rather a narrative that is absolutely critical of a planetary plan and a planetary action agenda. Most recently, I had the honor of co-chairing a process that Åsa Persson was very involved in, and Peter Gluckman, so the International Science Council, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and Future Earth convened a process on the eve of the Stockholm Plus 50 conference that just convened in Stockholm to write a letter, take two of a letter that was written 50 years ago by scientists to the first Stockholm conference, to the first environment conference in the world. And I was the co-chair with Sharad Lele of that process, bringing in scientists from around the world, including natural scientists, social scientists, engineers, and the humanities scholars, to say, what do we need to do? Answering Peter's question, what next? And through that initiative, we really came together, and I know that the letter will be in the chat. It was published in Nature. This is the call from science to society and to political leaders. We need to deliver on these plans, because ultimately our conclusion was we, and here I mean humanity, all of us at the individual, at the societal, at the global level, need to be, one, good ancestors. We need to be good ancestors. What does that require? How do we leave something for the rest of history to come? And two, we need to be better neighbors. So I would like to end on this note. We need to be good ancestors. We need to be better neighbors. And the science community, the knowledge sector, will be absolutely critical in taking that planetary plan, bringing it to the individual level, through the classrooms, through the narrative to political leaders, and delivering on what we have promised. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria Ivanova, for your excellent points. And I just add to your speech about to find also nature-based engineering solutions for solving the problems, but very inspiring. Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Åsa Persson, that is member of the 2023 Global Sustainable Development Report, independent group of scientists and research director, Stockholm Environmental Institute. Please, Åsa Persson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose, and a big thanks to ISC and WEFO for inviting me today. It's really an honor to join this conversation, which is so critical. And let me start also by really emphasizing what the president and Maria just said, about determination and commitment to this plan. I think it's a little bit unfortunate when we start talking in terms of optimism or pessimism. Let's just leave that aside. We need to be determined in our way forward. So I'm speaking to you today from New York, from the HLPF, and we are in the middle of working meetings actually to prepare this Global Sustainable Development Report, where the task is to take stock globally and incorporate the latest scientific evidence of how we can advance on the agenda. So on this first question on, why the slow progress? When we look at the data, and you have probably seen also the Secretary General's annual progress report released this week, it is depressing, and there are big setbacks. setbacks that we didn't really maybe expect 5 or 10 years ago, that we would see these increases in extreme poverty, in hunger. Of course, now during just the last year, when we have engaged with this data, it's not just the pandemic that we need to consider, what are the ripple effects, but also the war in Ukraine, of course, and now the cost of living and inflation crisis. So we're seeing this series of shocks, and we're trying to also look at the data. Are we talking about, temporary shocks that we will recover from, bounce back from, or how will they leave scars? For example, lost education years that will not only affect, of course, those students, individuals throughout their life course, but entire societies. But I think this is only the half truth, looking at these effects from these recent crises, because we knew that we were not on track to achieve the SDGs even before the pandemic. So I think you asked the question really in the right way. What are the structural barriers to achieving SDGs that were there before the pandemic? This is a bit more tricky, of course, to establish in scientific terms, attributing progress to these structural barriers. But I think the pattern we see now is very similar to 4 years ago when the first report was launched. The areas lagging furthest behind are really the environmental goals and SDG 10 on inequality. And I think my personal perspective here would be that really we're talking about the lack of political will more than anything else, perhaps also capacity in many cases, particularly in the low-income part of the world. I think what we see is really a lack of policy and incoherent policies that still sort of fuel these unsustainable trajectories that we're on. And for one, case in point is, of course, the recovery packages we saw after to recover from the pandemic, where a lot of fossil fuel energy was still being supported. So a couple of, just to mention a couple of structural barriers that we are looking at in the report are inequality, and what's really perhaps kind of new there, where we have new data, is on wealth inequality in addition to income inequality. And we know already there is very negative correlation between inequality and sustainability. So that's a key structural barrier, I would say. Another one, unsustainable consumption and production. This was very much in focus at the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting that Maria mentioned. And I think also, actually, if you look at all the scientific assessments now, the IPCC, IPBES, etc., they sort of converge on that we need to really address our economic systems as the root cause. So there are difficult structural barriers. We can make progress, and it was so inspiring to listen to the president for his perspective on this. But I think also looking at the agenda and the goals itself, I would agree with Maria in a way. They are ambitious, or they are not ambitious. They are, critical to survival. But I think if you look at starting point as well, they are ambitious. So when we have reviewed scenario studies for the report, we see that actually under the most sustainable scenarios, it's still going to be difficult to achieve all the SDGs by 2030. And we know also we're looking at also this new science around transformations, and it's clear that transformations take time. They take more than 7 years, which we are now into Agenda 2030. So does this mean that the goals are bad, that they are wrong? No, I don't think so. We just need to recommit. Finally, I want to say something about also, implementing the goals, which I think is maybe a little bit misrepresentation of how you achieve a goal. In my mind, you can work towards achievement of a goal by implementing ambitious policies. You can't really implement the goal. Of course, you can embed it in legal frameworks, in national strategies as well, but you need to have that real plan, you need also to have the policies and the actions. So I think this is maybe a little bit lacking in the SDG conversation. What is the theory of change? How do we move from sort of embedding SDGs in our normative frameworks, setting up SDG task forces, setting up SDG monitoring and accountability mechanisms at the national level? How does this really translate into ambitious policy initiatives, whether it's fossil fuel subsidy reform or something else. So turning to the second question we had, also, what can be done now? Should we start thinking about what comes after the SDGs, the sort of post-2030 agenda? I think I would agree with the previous speakers that, well, of course, in a way, I think it's very much science role to think, ahead, to have that foresight, start thinking about the new framework. That should be encouraged, but we also need to have this accountability and commitment to the goals, and we still have 8 years to go. So I see also a big potential for science to do even more on, evaluation, actually talking more about effectiveness and how can we make these policies work? Do we need to prioritize among the goals? What can we learn from the MDGs and the MDG acceleration framework that was put in place in 2010 with 5 years to go? So I think basically to wrap up, we need to move from all the good examples we have of SDG action and implementation to really trying to figure out what is the best practice, what is the most effective interventions that are going to take us to the goals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, other person, for your interesting reflections as well. Now I will give the floor to Albert van Jaarsveld, that is the Director General of the International Institute for Applied System Analysis and member of the International Science Council. Please, Albert, the floor is yours. Please, you are mute. Can you open your microphone, please, Albert?
Thank you, Jose.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And for this opportunity to talk to you about this very important topic. I think I'd like to start off by amplifying what people have said earlier, that for me, Agenda 2030 highlights some of our most pressing matters that we need to deal with as humanity. But unfortunately, progress thus far has been below par. This challenge has to be tackled against the background of our compound challenges that we face across the globe, and the fact that the world seems to be increasingly more fractious as we move ahead. So in this community and in this conversation, you'll find that there is a significant degree of urgency and some angst around our ability to deliver on the SDGs and the implementation by and large. And around that matter, I'd like to just mention a few short points. First of all, we must recognize that sustainability and the SDGs will not be achieved unilaterally by any individual nation state. It requires comprehensive multilateral action around matters of common interest in order to achieve the SDGs. That's something that we must recognize. On the other hand, we spend about 1% to 2% of our global agency-driven research funding on collective and open research around the globe. And this simply is not commensurate with the degree of urgency that we see around the SDGs at a global level. So what is required, in my view, is a more coherent, globally coordinated, and better, more participatory science implementation effort to more aggressively pursue the SDGs moving forward in the remaining 8 years that we have. Now, the original wish or assumption through the UN was that a bottom-up national government-led approach would enable steady progress around the SDGs. This is simply not materialized, with the few exceptions that we've discussed today already. And we understand that generally it's a lack of political will, but in my view, implementation of the SDGs is fundamentally flawed, and we need to think about that very seriously over the remaining 8 years. I think for many countries, many governments and agencies, the lists and targets of the SDGs were simply experienced as overwhelming. And one could argue that this is somehow that we had a perfect list and that somehow it's the enemy of the good. and that's why nothing happened. But I don't think so. I think the president's correct when he says we have a plan, we have a comprehensive plan for humanity and the planet, and we need to pursue that aggressively moving forward. The scientific community have spent some time trying to streamline and simplify the SDGs for easier consumption, both at a national and an international level. The matters that need to be addressed are urgent, but they are broad and they are overwhelming. I think what is required and what is a shortfall at the moment is that there's not any rational prioritization mechanism necessarily being applied across the SDGs, either at the national level or even at the international level. We must find novel ways to fast-track SDG implementation across the globe. In my view, the International Science Council science-oriented missions-driven initiative is an example of an attempt to fast-track SDG implementation. It focuses on processes of regional prioritization, a systems approach to resolving the SDGs, not one by one, ministry by ministry, because that will never work, as a unilateral achievement of SDGs will also not work. It focuses on co-production and a more inclusive approach, with societies being more participatory in the delivering of SDGs, so that it really does become not only part of the national agenda, but it becomes part of the regional, local community agenda in terms of our development objectives. I do think it's important that we think about strengthening the implementation by and large, because I think that's where the SDGs are falling flat. And we need to make sure that the processes are increasingly inclusive and that the processes are bought into by society at large. Otherwise, we will simply not achieve the SDG objectives. So I think the overall message is in the right direction. I think we must strengthen our implementation. Moving forward, Peter also asked us to reflect about, well, what next? And how do we recharge and strengthen our multilateral system to allow ourselves to, into the future, deliver on these shared and global problems that we have around the globe more effectively and more efficiently. It may be that we find ourselves at this time at a sort of a Bretton Woods moment around the globe, where we have to think about the mechanisms and the mechanics behind our multilateral systems and find a way to make them stronger, more efficient, more effective, and better positioned to really deliver on a collective global agenda, which we do have in front of us, which is Agenda 2030. So thank you. I'll leave it at that at this point.
Okay. Thank you very much, Albert, for your thoughts. Also the challenges that we are facing to the next steps. Finally, I will invite Alonso Brenes Torres, our last speaker, that is the coordinator of the Network for Social Studies on Disaster Risk Prevention in Latin America and Caribbean. Por favor, Alonso, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose. Good morning, everybody. Well, just let me start by mentioning some things we can see regarding the evolution of the 2030 agenda, although not necessarily learn, that is to see in the near future if we are learning something from all this. First, our international system, that is the ways we have structured globalization, is highly fragile and vulnerable. We clearly lack redundancy in our approach to global dynamics. I mean, how it is possible that a ship stuck in the Suez Canal put the economy of Europe upside down for weeks, or that we are on the verge of a global food crisis because the war in Ukraine. Those are processes that expose the fragility of globalization as we collectively have designed it, and it diminishes the confidence in people trying to go global and interconnect and foster networks of exchange in terms of social and economic growth. And I think that's a very clear diagnosis we are getting out the pandemic and the cascading effects we have in the aftermath. Given the scenarios that forecast more recurrent global shocks, I think it would be wise if we start thinking about really re-engineering the economic systems and its governance framework. Sometimes I have the impression that we keep trying to move to 21st century using approaches of the 19th century in many aspects. And I think we should put this also in revision. Clearly, we are highly exposed to this kind of shocks, not even necessarily of the order of a pandemic, and we don't have the proper mechanisms to protect the achievements of development, especially among the most vulnerable population. And after the pandemic, what we are seeing is a enormous erosion of the 2030 agenda achievements almost everywhere. We also can learn that although millions of people have overcome poverty through the Millennium Goals and the SDGs initiatives, our development structure is leaning toward generating high inequality conditions as a structural feature of the whole process. If you look at the work of Walter Schiedel about the planetary shocks through history, you can see that this is the first pandemic or great leveler, as he called him, from which we emerge to a more unequal world than before. Previous in history, after a global shock or a pandemic, we emerged with more equal conditions in terms of development. So I'll say that inequality is poison for the 2030 agenda, and it is putting its fruition into jeopardy. Inequality puts into question the value of democracy and the ethical principles that allow societies to function. And we are seeing examples of it around the world already, both in the North and the Global South alike. Inequality will hamper the progress of the 2030 agenda and also will compromise the progress achieved so far. Most of the people that could overcome the $2 daily threshold are still in very vulnerable situations, and many of those fell back or have high probabilities of falling back into poverty as a result of the impact we are suffering as a global system. And this situation should make us reflect on our well-being standards. Our metrics, I say, have a very low bar in terms of development. I mean, do we really think that going from earning $2 to $5 a day will do the trick for overcoming poverty in the long run? I really don't think so. Will any of us here in this forum will be content catching $100 per month and feeling secure about the future of our future and our families? I don't really think so. I think we need to revisit the standards and indicators for measuring progress, because we could be having a distorted sense of progress regarding the achievements of the 2030 agenda, I'm afraid. And this is a challenge that I can also see in the progress monitoring of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. At this moment, we are in the very similar process of monitoring progress. And as in the case of the SDGs, I have to say that the progress that we are seeing in terms of disaster risk reduction at the global level, it's very mild, for not saying disappointing. So I think it's a structural and systemic issue we have to address too. And if we don't resolve the well-being divide, we will be fueling more democratic decay and its ramifications through the world. That is terrorism, that is social unrest, that is drug trafficking, that is rampant corruption, and the rest of the plethora we know hamper development. Specifically from the point of view of disaster risk management, the horizon looks very, very cloudy as well. It is still soon to assess the damage of the new structure of disaster risk, but risk levels are sure higher than before the COVID outbreak. We could see since 2020 an increase in the damages derived from disasters, mainly due to the increase of vulnerability of governments and families alike exposed to natural hazard. The fiscal resilience of governments have diminished significantly after the pandemic. And the correlation is clear with the SDGs. Secure environments will depend on keeping underlying risk drivers controlled. That is, environmental degradation, fragile livelihoods, and weak governance, especially at the local level. If we can fix these areas, risk levels will automatically start to decline. That's way beyond proven. But so far, we haven't get a traction robust enough to keep a clear improvement through these years. We need to insist on the notion that disaster risk is not about hazards, but the vulnerability and exposure conditions, and that's putting in a different way, disaster risk is a development externality. It's consubstantial to development. It's not something that goes in parallel or goes from the outside. It is in the DNA of development, the germ of disaster risk. This is something we need to, as a scientific community, we need to communicate this better, more compellingly. And this is a flaw we scientists must recognize and have the humility of asking for help to deliver the right message to the right audiences. Just the other day, I revisited a paper from 1976 where the authors argue about how we need to remove the natural from the natural disaster notion. They argue about the need to guide development through precautionary principles and how it was necessary to generate evidence to inform public policies. I mean, there was 1976 and the relevance of the argument remains almost intact. The only difference then is that now we have the data, now we have the evidence. In the article back then, they were still discussing about the magnitude of global warming. But we have the models now, we have the communication platforms, we have all that is necessary, the routes, the how-tos. We only lack of political will and commitment. I mean, that's why I argue that this is not a scientific issue, not anymore at least. This is a political and ethical challenge we are facing as a species. We have the data and the evidence, but still the Supreme Court cuts the informant's capacity for the EPA, despite the country's contribution to global warming in the United States. We have the science and the modeling capacities, but hazard and risk map are disregarded at the national, at the local level through Latin America and the Caribbean, mainly in front of an economic imperative, usually working in tandem with corruption schemes. That's the reality many communities are facing in our continent. So let's not mislead the debate. This is not about more science. It's all about start listening to what scientists have to say, make people accountable for ignoring the messages at the expenses of the public interest. Many of us in the scientific community know we need to be more compelling and innovative in presenting arguments and evidence. And we have been working on it for some years now. But in the end, the fundamental transformation will arrive when citizenship at large demands more saliency for science, more attention to the evidence from the politicians, and more accountability for the decision makers for actions they push regarding the public well-being without taking science into consideration. We have been followed the script as scientific community. We have been followed the script. We have reviewed the data. Despite budgetary cuts, despite people now suddenly thinking flat eats air or vaccine will put chips into people, it's I think something that fell into the realm of communication and transparency. And this can only be achieved through a decisive and aggressive investment in education for everybody. Educational capacity has suffered a hard hit due to the pandemic, as well as the rest of development priorities. But now we have the opportunity to show that we learn from history. I don't know if you remember the Asia crisis in the 90s. They learned the lessons very quickly back then, without SDGs, without the Millennium Development Goals. Despite the financial constraints, government decide to refuel investment in education, science, and technology in that opportunity. And let's go look at the effects in well-being 20 years after that in Asian countries. But sadly, this time, what I can see is in many countries, especially in Latin America, where education is falling under the austerities measures umbrella, and decision makers see the agenda in education as an expense instead of as investment for the future. To me, this is the main structural priority for the 2030 agenda in order to create enabling environments for science to thrive in and being used for the public, mass public. It may not be a very popular measure in terms of political returns, but it will show commitment and responsibility. Lastly, just let me say that in terms of disaster risk reduction, I say that the emphasis on public services resilience is a promissory field for interaction and better coordination between different areas of development, and a way and a nice platform to meet each other in our proper capacities. Inequality can be overcome through delivery of good quality social services and productive services that can add value to labor markets. And this is a sustainable way to overcome poverty. And this is critical, especially for the most vulnerable population. Poverty reduction will depend on resilient public service with other multiple direct and indirect benefits. I'd say this might be a decent way to fast track the 2030 agenda, although I'm not sure if with the model we have nowadays, I would like to see things more moving faster if the outcome still will be delivered just for a few. I leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alonso, for your inspiring words as well. And now we have time for some questions. I don't see if Anda, can you help me on this part of the meeting? No.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
We have received some questions, and we thank everyone for your questions and very interesting reflections. So one first question that we would like to ask the panelists is, we have heard, everyone mention in their intervention, in their reflections, that the SDGs provide us with a roadmap for achieving a sustainable and resilient development and well-being for all. But how can science better support implementation, and what science policy collaborations need to be built to better learn from each other and to steer and accelerate action?
Okay, and I will add not only about the science, but also engineering, also technology to the questions. And I don't know if any of our speakers want to answer to this very interesting question.
Albert, you've done a lot of thinking about this. Why don't you have a crack?
I'll do that, Peter, if that's okay.
Okay.
I think I've made some reference in my talk about the International Science Council missions, science mission orientated initiative to really try and ground the implementation or the development of the SDGs. I think I can't go into all the details of what's being discussed, but there's a group of people working, there's a task force working on behalf of the ISC and on behalf of the Commission for the Science Missions Initiative to come up with a strategy to implement this. But I can give you broad strokes about what is being considered in that conversation. First of all, the idea is that we need to build capacity in what they call boundary spanning organizations. In other words, organizations that are embedded in regions that can facilitate conversations and discussions amongst all stakeholders of that particular region to, first of all, to do a few things. First of all, to think through what is the SDG landscape in that region and what are the issues on the ground that have to be prioritized. To assist that discussion through some technical support in terms of analytical and visualization approaches that allow the community as a whole to visualize the potential development pathways or interventions that may be required in that space, that can allow them to collectively form an agenda about how to implement the SDGs in a particular region. This is based on a truly transdisciplinary approach. In other words, the ideas of co-design, co-production, and co-implementation together with all regional partners and stakeholders. And the idea is to forge a collective agenda for that region, which can then be translated into action. The idea is also that we are trying to put together mechanisms to fund these initiatives from a global perspective, collectively through a consortium of funders, because we often know that it doesn't happen on the ground if there's no funding base to fundamentally support this. So this is the kind of things that we're thinking about. And I mean, this will certainly become a key agenda for the International Science Council, hopefully moving forward. But along those lines, we hope we can bring communities together to make the SDGs part of their collective development agenda within a region, and to ensure that the political buy-in is no longer a barrier, but the political buy-in becomes a facilitator for us to implement the SDGs at the ground level.
Okay, thank you.
Jose.
Thank you, Albert. We have also some more time to the question. Maybe I can ask answer person and Maria Ivanova the following. We have in the world very high diversity of development in the countries. We have different cultural environments, and when we state so broad goals, do you think that the cultural barriers or constraints of the different points of the globe, is this one major, I can say, difficulty, okay, for advance the UN SDGs or not? As a person, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important to remind ourselves that in the 2015 resolution, there was actually an active invitation to member states and other actors to internalize the agenda. So countries were actually actively encouraged to develop national targets. So in my understanding, Agenda 2030 was never intended as this global blueprint, you know, everyone has to approach this in the exact same way. So I think that's really important. And I saw there was also a question in the chat here, what was the impact of the Global Sustainable Development Report and the framework that they offered in 2019? And we are now looking at that, and we see some evidence where, for example, the Netherlands had used some parts of that network, but adapted it and internalized it, you know, to their particular challenges. So I think you're right. Of course, it needs to be interpreted, you know, to the local and national culture. And I think the president made a very, you know, compelling case of how Costa Rica had approached this, and it needs to speak to people at the end of the day. But it is a flexible roadmap that will allow for that. If I can also just make a comment on the science, the role of science here, I think it's first of all, I want to thank ISE for generously supporting the GSDR with organizing the peer review. That will be a great opportunity to actually get input from the scientific community to make sure that we cover all the new important sustainability science findings for the report. And I also really like this idea of you know, taking a more regional perspective, or even that can be translated into more national and even local collaborations, science policy makers. I would particularly again want to highlight that I think science can do much more on evaluation. There are some really interesting initiatives on sort of evidence review, you know, what are not just the good practices, but really the best, most effective practices and means of implementation. But also scenarios and foresight. And I know this is a strong focus as well of many members of ISC. I think looking at Our Common Agenda report by the UN Secretary General, you know, he proposes a future summit and engaging more in foresight. And I think that would be also a wonderful new activity to engage at the local, national, regional level in foresight and scenarios to also help generate this, you know, not just being disappointed with the lack of progress to date, but looking at the opportunities of the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maria, do you want to add some?
Yes.
Please.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And you framed this as, there are different development levels, or levels of development differ, cultures differ. Indeed, that is what diversity is about. That differs at a global level. It differs within countries. And we need to embrace that. And yet we need to integrate this global vision, this global community, the solidarity throughout our policies and our goals. I really appreciate what Osa said about we cannot implement goals, we can implement policies. And as now the new director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University, I'm going to take this, Osa, and embed it in my work and encourage students to think about policies. And these different levels need to give us a narrative of possibility. And I wouldn't say, yes, optimism, but the narrative of possibility. Because what Cristiana Figueres, the former executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, says again and again, impossible is not a fact, it's an attitude. And so if we take that as the core and embrace what in the chat Lena Savold is talking about, this consciousness, this awareness, this movement from within. And I would encourage you to read what Lena's put in the chat. And I want to end by reflecting on this and point on her comment there and pointing to something that really moved me in Stockholm a few weeks ago, because I was present at that conference that Osa Parshad was organizing, the science conference. And you think this is the conference of scientists, and we're going to talk about the science and how dreary the situation is and what needs to be done. The first thing we are in that auditorium is 2 young students actually performing a play based on abstracts, excerpts from various speeches of young people, whether it's Greta Thunberg or others, and creating art from the commitments that we have made, from the observations we have made. And one thing that they said really struck me and has stayed with me also, more than any science assessment or scientific input. What these people said at the end, if we only listen to science, that will be our undoing. It hit me so hard as a scientist that we cannot only listen to science. We need to have art. We need to have the humanities. We need to have these values come from within. And how do we talk about the students in our classrooms? How do we talk to our neighbors? How do we talk to our family? How do we talk to the politicians and to the world about these values, these integrity systems? And that's where this diversity, Jose, comes together, is that we embrace diversity, and that gives us power.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I had always the feeling that when we talk about science and scientists, sometimes we forget that we have also the scientist application, the science application that is made by the engineers. And we have a lot of work to have our engineers also embedded with this spirit for developing this sustainable development. So this, I can say, this meeting with the scientists and the engineers are important to have this symbiosis in the same ideas, the same objectives. Maybe I can have a final word from Alonso in this. We just 3 minutes, but we can have also your opinion about this, please.
Yeah, telegraphically.
Yes.
I'll insist, and in two particular things. First, we as scientific community, we need to recognize each other in multi and transdisciplinary frameworks for operation. I mean, that's critical. At least in Latin America, we're still very siloed oriented in terms of scientific production, and also we need to be more innovative and creative. Let me just give you a quick example of the thing we are planning for the next regional platform on disaster risk management in Montevideo, Uruguay next February. We are going to have a panel of very well-known scientists in both natural and science and social sciences, in front of a panel of creative experts of advertising agencies of Latin America. And the lab is to present, they as a scientist will present very briefly the results of their research, any given research. And the notion is that the advertisers experts will assess the quality of how they can deliver the message to the audience. And the subtitle of the session is, can your ego take the punch? Because I think we have, as a scientific community, a lot of ego sometimes in the way we try to approach to the people who not only are not scientists, but they define their living standards by non-scientific knowledge through cultural values. We need to be more empathic as a community in order to there is a notion Indian philosopher used to say, the intercultural prolification, and I like that because it's merging different points of view about reality and making something new out of it in a way, in a field of respect and recognition of diversity and things. I think we have a very wide agenda to start communicating science in a better way to the final users. And as somebody said before, cut the middleman, going straight to the people who will be benefit from the scientific products.
Okay, thank you very much, Alonso. Now we are coming to the end of our meeting. I must thank you very much for your brilliant and excellent interventions. Our speakers today was very interesting. Our questions and one's answers. Okay, but our thoughts are very important for the way further in our organizations. Now I will give the floor to Peter Gluckman to shortly summarize the discussions and make some concluding remarks. But before, Peter, I must say to you that for me was a very how to say, exciting this co-organization of our two organizations, and maybe is the first step for a long journey with our organization. Thank you very much. Please, the floor is yours, Peter.
Thank you. Well, of course, we had a very rich conversation, and we really needed probably another day and a half to debate and discuss it in depth. But one word comes to my mind, or several words: gaps, chasms, crevasses. And why I say that is we've talked at length about the gap between the vision as laid out in the plan and the planetary plan, the goals. And the reality is that most governments are not bringing them into domestic policy directly, and they're certainly not getting communicated through to the average citizen. And I think we now know so much more about the fact that we need to make this bottom up. And how we do that and how we create a narrative that makes it bottom up. Because it's only by bottom up demands that governments and other people in power will actually incorporate it in a way that's meaningful rather than just being rhetoric. The second gap that's there is one we've not discussed particularly, but one that I feel very strongly about. It's the scientists, and it's what I call the gap in risk communication. We can do all the risk assessments we like in the world, but if they're not listened to, they've not been communicated. And if you think about, I remember speaking at COP26, when I heard some of our colleagues saying we need more money for science to understand what the world will look like in 2200 or whatever. We need to act now. And the science that's needed is, why are policy makers not responding to risk assessments? Why are societies not responding to, why do we not get behavioral change that's needed in so many ways? We're focusing the science in the wrong place. We need to build social science in these key areas of how decisions are made at different levels so much more. The ISC's put a lot of effort into bridging the gap between social and natural sciences, the humanities, engineering, technologies, and so forth. But on all of these, we need to use that integration to improve the translation of our knowledge and getting away from scientific communication for the good of the scientific community to communication which is heard and responded to by the audience that's needed. Albert raised, and several of you raised, at the heart of this is we need co-designed science, co-designed translational knowledge, be it through engineering, public policy, community action. Co-design research is still poorly funded, poorly addressed, and it takes time, and funding systems around the world do not doing that well. And that leads on to the work that Albert talked about in terms of new approaches to science funding and systems to promote transdisciplinarity in its true form, which does mean stakeholder engagement. It's more than multidisciplinarity. It does mean co-design. And that means a whole new way of thinking in science is needed. And that's hard against the fact we all know the anchors that hold us back. There's much more I could say, and then lend two things. Maria, coming from a small country, myself, I think your line that small nations can and must take a lead is true. And I think it's something because we can get the actors together more effectively there. And finally, I'm going to end on one last point. We're dealing with the multilateral system. I think it was Albert who raised the issue of another Bretton Woods. The multilateral system's failed us in COVID, it's failed us on conflict, it's failed us on climate change, the formal system I'm talking about. What worked in COVID was the informal multilateral system of scientists, engineers, technologists working across jurisdictional boundaries. Unfortunately, we're in a world where the multilateral system, the formal one, is very fractured. In that situation, the obligation is on the track two organizations, like the World Federation of Engineering organizations, like the International Science Council and others, to create the scaffold and build that scaffold that can allow for multilateral action to occur. And that, I think, is key, because much of this discussion has been putting it on the governments. I would say we need to strengthen the track two organizations for them to play a greater role. I want to thank all the speakers, all of them. It was good, a great conversation. I'm just frustrated that we've got to bring it to an end, and say once more to Jose, it's a pleasure, a real pleasure that we in the World Federation of Engineers organizations have come together over the last few months. It's a synergy we must build and grow on. Thank you all very much, and let's try and make some action happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.